Why a chosen man always walks alone. The man who walks alone is likely to find himself in places no one has ever seen. This timeless insight captures the heart of today's message, because a chosen man's path is often solitary, not as a punishment, but as a sacred doorway to clarity, strength, and spiritual wisdom. In this journey, solitude becomes a teacher, silence becomes guidance, and separation becomes the very ground where transformation begins. As you listen, I invite you to reflect on your own path. Have you ever felt called to walk alone, even when you didn't understand why? Share your experience in the comments below, because your story may be the reminder someone else needs today. Let's explore this powerful truth together and learn how to apply it in our daily lives for deeper growth and lasting happiness. 1. He withdraws from superficial social norms. A spiritually awakened man withdraws from superficial social norms because he begins to see clearly how much of everyday interaction is built on performance rather than truth. He no longer feels the need to participate in conversations rooted in gossip, comparison, or the constant search for approval, because these behaviors pull him away from authenticity. What used to feel normal now feels heavy, and what used to feel comfortable now feels false. This is not a retreat from people. It is a retreat from shallow spaces where his inner growth cannot breathe. As his spiritual awakening deepens, he notices how many social exchanges are driven by ego people, speaking to be validated, not understood. People gathering to be seen, not to connect. People agreeing just to belong, not because they believe in what they say. He senses these unspoken layers, and because he can feel the energetic weight behind them, he steps back to protect his peace. He no longer pretends to fit into places where depth is unwelcome. Conversations that once entertained him now feel empty, because he can sense the difference between genuine presence and habitual noise. This awareness brings a natural shift. He seeks quality over quantity, sincerity over performance, and truth over comfort. He realizes that when the soul is evolving, the environment must evolve with it. If not, the misalignment becomes too loud to ignore. His withdrawal is simply the soul choosing clarity. With every layer of spirituality he uncovers, it becomes harder for him to tolerate spaces where he must shrink, dim, or silence the deeper parts of himself just to blend in. As he steps away from superficial norms, he discovers that solitude offers a type of nourishment that shallow interactions never could. He begins to understand that silence is not emptiness. It is information. It reveals who he is when no one is watching, and it strengthens the inner voice he once overlooked. In solitude, he hears truth without distortion, and it is this clarity that guides him toward a higher version of himself. The more he learns to trust this inner alignment, the less he is willing to compromise it for temporary acceptance. His distance does not come from pride, but from discernment. A spiritually awakened man sees beyond behavior. He sees intention. He can feel when someone shows up with sincerity and when someone shows up with an agenda. This sensitivity is not a weakness. It is the direct outcome of spiritual awakening, the sharpening of intuition that makes him aware of emotional undercurrents others ignore. And because he values depth, he refuses to remain in places where depth is absent. He no longer chases connection. He waits for the right connection. His solitude becomes a refining ground, where he grows stronger, clearer, and more grounded in who he truly is. He learns to detach from the expectations that once controlled him and to walk his path without needing external approval. Through this process, he realizes that walking alone is not loneliness, it is alignment. It is the soul choosing truth over comfort, authenticity over conformity, and inner peace over superficial belonging. This is why a chosen man withdraws from shallow social norms, not to escape the world, but to rise above what no longer matches his spirit. If this truth resonates with you, declare it with conviction. Comment below. I walk my path with purpose. 2. He sees through illusions of connection. When you step onto the path of spirituality and true spiritual development, you begin to notice the quiet truth beneath the surface of human connection. And this is why Alan Watts's insight resonates so deeply. He sees through illusions of connection. You start to realize that many relationships in your life were never rooted in truth or emotional depth, but were built on habit, convenience, and unspoken agreements. People become attached to routines. Conversations turn into repetitive noise, and the sense of belonging you once felt begins to feel hollow when your soul becomes more aware. As your inner clarity grows, you notice how often people bond out of fear rather than purpose, clinging to each other, not because their spirits align, but because they're afraid to face themselves alone. This awareness naturally pulls you away from shallow interactions, not because you are better than anyone, but because your inner world has expanded beyond what surface-level connections can hold. You begin valuing silence more than empty chatter, authenticity more than approval, and emotional presence more than forced closeness. The more your spiritual development deepens, the more clearly you see the subtle masks people wear to feel accepted, masks shaped by insecurity, expectations, or fear of rejection. These realizations make it difficult for you to participate in conversations that lack honesty or purpose because they no longer nourish you. They only take from you. Instead of forcing yourself to fit into spaces where your soul feels unseen, you naturally drift toward solitude, a solitude that doesn't feel like isolation, but like alignment. This quiet space helps you hear your own thoughts, recognize your own needs, and understand your own truth without distraction, revealing that walking alone is sometimes the clearest expression of self-respect. As this awareness deepens, you notice that the chosen man doesn't walk alone out of pride or emotional coldness. He walks alone because he refuses to settle for connections built on illusions. He understands that genuine connection cannot be forced, negotiated, or maintained by habit. It must arise from truth, resonance, shared purpose, and mutual presence. When that kind of connection appears, it feels effortless and grounding. When it doesn't, he no longer chases, entertains, or sacrifices himself to maintain the illusion that he belongs somewhere he no longer fits. This clarity becomes both a filter and a guide, helping him recognize which relationships support his growth and which ones exist only to fill emotional space. As you walk this path yourself, you begin to trust the quiet wisdom that accompanies solitude. You stop feeling guilty for outgrowing certain people because you understand that spiritual development naturally reshapes your relationships. You stop searching for validation in temporary attention because you realize that real belonging comes from truth, not convenience. And you stop fearing the moments when you must walk alone because you finally see that these moments are not signs of loss, but signs of alignment. Moments when your soul steps into a higher rhythm that only truth can match. 3. His silence signals clarity, not coldness. His silence is not a sign of coldness, but a reflection of clarity. And you can feel it the moment you're in his presence, because a chosen man carries a kind of quiet that unsettles those who depend on noise to feel significant. What most people call arrogance is simply the absence of performance, and what they call distance is the absence of pretending. He no longer flatters anyone to be liked, no longer participates in the social games that people use to protect their insecurities, and no longer bends himself into shapes that make others comfortable. As Alan Watts once said, "When you're free to do what you want, you are more responsible for who you are." And this freedom strips away every layer of false identity until silence becomes a natural language. When you see him choosing quiet instead of conversation, presence instead of noise, authenticity instead of approval, understand that he is not withdrawing from the world, he is returning to himself. This inner clarity makes others uncomfortable because his honesty exposes their masks. People are used to interactions built on subtle lies, polite smiles that hide resentment, compliments that disguise insecurity, and small talk that covers emptiness. But he refuses to participate, and in that refusal, he reveals how much of society's communication is performance. His silence becomes a mirror reflecting what others don't want to see in themselves, and that's why they react with judgment, labeling him distant, strange, or prideful. Yet the truth is that he has simply outgrown the need for external validation. He no longer seeks applause, agreement, or permission to be who he is. He is guided by an inner compass, shaped by spiritual wisdom and deep self-awareness. And this quiet conviction creates a kind of presence that cannot be manipulated or controlled. As his inner world strengthens, solitude becomes nourishing rather than lonely. In silence, he hears the truth more clearly. In stillness, he understands himself more deeply. And when he no longer relies on the crowd to define his worth, he begins walking a path that only a few can walk with him. This is why chosen men often walk alone, not because they reject others, but because very few people can exist in the presence of unfiltered authenticity. When you stop performing, when you stop pleasing, when you stop molding yourself for acceptance, you naturally disconnect from those who only knew how to love the version of you that wasn't real. His solitude is not isolation, but alignment, and in that alignment, he discovers an inner power that can't be shaken by opinions, expectations, or criticism. His silence signals that he is no longer afraid to be misunderstood. It signals that he trusts his own judgment more than the noise around him. It signals that he has stepped into a deeper awakening, the kind of awakening Alan Watts described when he said, "To be silent is to listen, and to listen is to understand." And so he walks alone, not as a man who has lost connection, but as a man who has found the courage to live without compromise, without performance, and without the need to be anything other than who he truly is. Have you noticed how silence becomes a source of clarity for a chosen man? If this message resonates with you, share your experience in the comments so others can reflect and learn from it. And if you're just beginning to understand the power of quiet truth, simply comment, "I will listen within," to join this journey of deeper spiritual wisdom together. 4. He embraces solitude as growth, not isolation. He embraces solitude as growth, not isolation, because he has reached a level of spiritual awakening where quiet no longer feels like emptiness, but like nourishment. What once felt like distance now feels like alignment, and what others fear in silence, he welcomes as a doorway back to himself. Through deep stillness, he begins to see that solitude becomes sacred the moment he stops interpreting it as a sign of lack. It is not loneliness that surrounds him, but space for clarity, space for healing, and space for the mind to breathe after being weighed down by expectations and noise. In this state, solitude transforms from something he endures into something he chooses, and the choice itself becomes a declaration of inner growth. He no longer fears silence or stillness because he understands that silence reveals the truths that noise tries to bury. Instead of running from his own thoughts, he learns to sit with them, listen to them, and understand them. The quiet stops feeling like a reminder of what is missing and becomes a reminder of everything he has within. With every moment alone, he becomes more aware of who he really is beneath the roles he was taught to play. This is where spirituality becomes real, not in theories or rituals, but in the honest confrontation between a man and his inner world. As he lets the mind settle, presence returns, intuition sharpens, and a deeper sense of purpose slowly emerges from within. Solitude provides strength because it teaches him how to stand on the foundation of his own being. Rather than leaning on the approval of others, he realizes that constantly seeking company dilutes self-awareness, while guarding time alone strengthens the inner core. In solitude, he sees his patterns, recognizes his fears, and learns to respond to life with intention instead of reactivity. It is here, in the quiet, that emotional resilience is built. It is here that he discovers boundaries, self-respect, and the ability to separate what nurtures him from what drains him. Each silent moment becomes a lesson in spiritual wisdom, reminding him that growth often arrives in gentle whispers rather than dramatic revelations. Solitude becomes his natural state because it aligns him with the rhythm of his own spirit. He no longer feels the need to justify why he prefers peace over chaos or depth over superficial connection. He notices that the more time he spends in stillness, the more centered and grounded he becomes. He feels less pulled by distractions and more guided by intuition. The world may still call him alone, but he knows that he is alone only in the physical sense, not spiritually, not emotionally, and not in purpose. This path allows him to hear his inner voice without interference, to see life without distortion, and to walk forward with a clarity that only solitude can cultivate. As his spiritual awakening deepens, solitude becomes the environment where he thrives. It gives him the peace needed to understand himself fully and the strength needed to move through life with confidence. In this quiet space, he reconnects with parts of himself that were neglected, forgotten, or overshadowed. He heals, he grows, and he rises not because the world applauds him, but because his soul finally has the room to expand. Solitude is no longer a temporary escape. It is a sacred home where he becomes the truest version of who he was meant to be. 5. He stops playing the social validation game. A chosen man, once he steps into a deeper level of spirituality and spiritual development, naturally stops playing the social validation game because he finally understands the heavy price of performing for approval. He no longer engages out of duty, emotional politeness, or the need to maintain appearances, as he realizes that every forced interaction drains him and pulls him further away from his true self. When he stops doing things just to be seen, when he stops bending himself into shapes that please people, he breaks the invisible chain that ties his worth to external feedback. His worth no longer depends on applause, attention, or being included. And in this shift, he begins to feel a profound inner freedom that many people spend their entire lives chasing but never reach. This transformation does not come from pride. It comes from clarity. He recognizes the subtle way society teaches men to perform: smile, even when tired, agree, even when hesitant, show up, even when empty, and he refuses to live in that quiet self-betrayal any longer. He becomes radically honest with himself about where his energy goes, who drains it, and what environments suffocate his spirit. He stops engaging in shallow conversations just to fill silence, stops attending gatherings to maintain image, and stops trying to be the likable one to avoid judgment. As he grows, he learns that constantly seeking validation is a form of spiritual poverty, a habit that keeps the soul small. So he detaches from the noise of people who measure worth through popularity, attention, or social hierarchy. He no longer needs to impress anyone because his focus has shifted toward preserving his peace, protecting his energy, and honoring his inner calling. This often makes others confused or even uncomfortable, but he understands that being misunderstood is part of awakening. He would rather walk alone than shrink himself to fit into spaces that no longer match his spirit. In this solitude, something powerful happens. His intuition sharpens, his clarity deepens, and he begins to feel a strength that does not depend on anyone's approval. He becomes selective with his time, intentional with his presence, and deeply aware that not everyone deserves access to him. Walking alone becomes a conscious act of self-respect, not isolation. He no longer fears being unseen or unrecognized because he no longer needs the world to validate what he already knows within himself. His energy is now preserved for what truly matters: his purpose, his evolution, and the meaningful relationships that nurture his spiritual development rather than drain it. If this message resonates with you, give the video a like, subscribe to Spiritual Wisdom, and share your thoughts below. Tell us how you're stepping away from the need for validation, and let's continue uncovering the truth behind reason number 6 together. 6. He disrupts the social illusion simply by being honest. A chosen man disrupts the social illusion simply by choosing honesty over performance, because the moment he stops reinforcing the unspoken rules of constant agreement, emotional flattery, and polite pretending, the entire structure of his relationships begins to shift. You see this in your own life too. The moment you stop nodding along just to keep the peace, people start to react not to who you truly are, but to the loss of the version of you that made them feel comfortable. As Alan Watts said, waking up to who you are requires letting go of who you imagine yourself to be. And when a chosen man lets go of that imagined self, he exposes the invisible contracts that others rely on. They don't pull away because he suddenly became difficult. They pull away because he stopped supporting the illusions they built their identities on. Honesty, when it is consistent and unfiltered, becomes a light that reveals the emotional dependencies people prefer to hide. when he no longer offers automatic validation, those who depended on his softness begin to feel exposed. When he speaks his truth, instead of cushioning it with flattery, those who depend on ego reinforcement feel threatened. And when he stops performing emotional labor for people who only take, they interpret his clarity as cruelty. Yet nothing changed except the fact that he stopped protecting their illusions. As Carl Jung said, people will do anything to avoid facing their own souls. So when you stand in truth, you become a mirror that many cannot bear to look into. His presence becomes a quiet disruption, not through rebellion, but through alignment. An alignment so authentic that it reveals who is real and who only loved the version of him that served their comfort. This is why solitude surrounds a chosen man when he steps into honesty. Not because he is cold, but because most relationships were built on expectations he can no longer carry. Distance becomes clarity. Silence becomes protection. The absence of certain people becomes proof that he has outgrown the illusions that once required his participation. And the more deeply he chooses truth, the more obvious it becomes that authenticity thins the crowd but strengthens the soul. 7. He redefines friendship and connection. He redefines friendship and connection the moment his spirituality deepens. Because a chosen man in a state of spiritual awakening no longer measures relationships by how many people surround him, but by how deeply each connection aligns with truth. As his awareness sharpens, he realizes that many friendships were built on noise, convenience, or emotional dependence rather than genuine resonance. And so, he begins to value the quiet friendships, the rare ones where presence is enough, where neither person has to perform a role, entertain the other, or fill silence out of discomfort. Alan Watts once said, "The meaning of life is just to be alive." It is so plain and so obvious, and yet everybody rushes around in a great panic as if it were necessary to achieve something beyond themselves. This wisdom shapes the way he now approaches connection, because the more he awakens spiritually, the less he tolerates anything that pulls him away from simply being real. He no longer clings to relationships that depend on what he can give rather than who he truly is, because he notices how often people attach themselves to him out of need, needing reassurance, emotional labor, validation, or a constant source of strength. A chosen man in spiritual awakening sees this pattern clearly, and once he does, he no longer allows himself to be drained by it. He chooses instead the friendships that feel like soft ground, where he can sit in silence without fear, where he doesn't have to hide his fatigue, and where the connection breathes on its own without pressure or imbalance. These relationships are not loud or dramatic. They are quiet, rare, and deeply alive, built on mutual presence, on seeing one another without masks, without agendas, without trying to shape the moment into something it is not. This is why his circle becomes smaller, but stronger, because he now understands that real connection requires two awakened hearts willing to meet in truth. He gravitates toward people who don't need to fill silence with chatter, who understand that silence can be sacred, and who know that stillness often reveals more than words. He values the kind of friendship where awareness is shared, where the conversation flows naturally, but the silence flows too, where honesty feels effortless, and where both people walk away feeling lighter, not heavier. The more he honors this, the more he sees how much of his past relationships were rooted in imbalance, and how his spiritual awakening makes him incapable of returning to those old dynamics. To him, connection is no longer about proximity, but resonance. It is no longer about how often someone appears, but how deeply they understand. It is no longer about filling loneliness, but about recognizing the rare souls who can sit beside him in full presence. He respects the friendships where both sides contribute to the energy between them, where there is no competition, no silent expectations, no hidden resentment, only mutual awareness and quiet trust. And as he embraces this new way of relating, he learns that solitude was never a punishment, but a purification, revealing the few who were meant to walk beside him and releasing the many who were not. 8. He walks alone in peace, not in pain. He walks alone in peace, not in pain, because his solitude is not rejection, but liberation. And when you look closely, you see that he chooses this path not out of fear or isolation, but because he understands that truth always comes with a price that demands authenticity over acceptance and inner alignment over outer approval. His journey teaches you that when a man reaches a certain depth of spirituality, he no longer waits for the world to wake up or change before he feels whole. Instead, he discovers that wholeness rises from within through steady spiritual development, not through the shifting moods of those around him. This is why he separates himself from noise, drama, and people who thrive on distraction, because he knows that clarity cannot coexist with chaos, and peace cannot survive in environments built on superficial validation. And as he continues forward, you begin to see that solitude becomes his sanctuary, a place where his thoughts become sharper, his intuition becomes stronger, and his truth becomes clearer. He realizes that walking alone does not mean he is unloved. It means he refuses to abandon himself for the comfort of being accepted by those who fear depth, honesty, or growth. He walks this path because he knows that people who are intimidated by truth will always misunderstand those who live by it. And so he moves differently, quietly, intentionally, with a calmness that comes from knowing who he is without needing anyone to confirm it. In that quiet journey, he discovers that silence is not empty. It is full of answers, and aloneness is not a void. It is fertile ground for clarity, strength, and self-respect. He no longer tries to force connections, convince others, or shrink himself to stay in rooms that dim his light, because he finally understands that loneliness born from growth is far more sacred than belonging born from pretending. His steps become lighter as he realizes he is not walking away from people, he is walking toward himself. And that is where true freedom, true meaning, and true spiritual expansion begin. And as you witness this path, you are invited to see the same truth for yourself, that your peace matters more than your popularity, that your alignment matters more than being liked, and that your growth matters more than staying somewhere that asks you to abandon who you are. You begin to feel that the journey of a chosen man mirrors the journey you are called to make, a journey where you allow solitude to refine you, integrity to guide you, and truth to free you. A journey where your spiritual development becomes stronger than your fear of walking alone, and where spirituality becomes the ground on which you stand with clarity, courage, and unwavering self-worth. If this message spoke to your soul, let's build a peaceful and supportive space together. Comment below. I choose peace over pain. And whenever you see someone sharing this affirmation, give them a like or reply with something encouraging. Let's lift each other up as we walk this path of spiritual wisdom together. If you agree, comment 1, so I know how many peaceful hearts are here with us. In the end, the path of a chosen man is not defined by loneliness, but by purpose. He walks alone because he refuses to betray his truth, his inner calling, and the quiet wisdom that guides his steps. And as Alan Watts reminds us, solitude is not a burden. It is a place where clarity, strength, and spiritual wisdom are born. If this message resonates with you, let it inspire you to honor your own journey with courage and authenticity. If you found value in this video, please like, share, and subscribe to Spiritual Wisdom. And don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss our upcoming videos. Your support helps this community grow, and your presence truly matters. The danger of outgrowing everyone around you. The only way to make sense out of change is to plunge into it, move with it, and join the dance. Alan Watts. Today on Spiritual Wisdom, we're exploring a powerful truth many people secretly face. The moment you start growing faster than the world around you, this experience can feel lonely, confusing, and even painful. Yet it is often the clearest sign that you're stepping into a higher version of yourself. As you listen, I invite you to reflect on your own journey. Have you ever felt yourself outgrowing relationships, environments, or even old versions of who you used to be? Share your thoughts in the comments, because your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear. Let's dive in and discover how to turn this uncomfortable transition into a path toward deeper happiness and true personal freedom. 1. Spiritual growth often leads to isolation. Spiritual growth often leads to isolation because as you awaken, you begin to perceive life differently from those around you. And this shift quietly separates you from the familiar world you once belonged to. At first, the changes feel subtle. You notice that certain conversations drain you, certain environments feel too loud or too shallow, and certain relationships that once felt comforting now feel heavy on your spirit. This happens because spiritual awakening is not simply a change in mindset, it is a change in inner frequency. When your awareness expands, your sensitivity sharpens, your intuition strengthens, and you begin to crave depth, authenticity, and emotional truth in ways you never did before. This new way of seeing makes the old world feel strangely distant, and even when you try to stay the same, your soul gently refuses to shrink back to who you were. Like a butterfly among caterpillars, your transformation becomes obvious even if you say nothing, because your energy, values, and worldview no longer align with the people who have not yet begun their own inner evolution. As your spirituality deepens, you naturally drift away from those who still operate from fear, habit, or autopilot living. And this drifting is not rejection. It is energetic misalignment. People who once understood you may now misunderstand you, because while you are seeking meaning, they are seeking comfort. While you are expanding, they are repeating old patterns. While you are breaking cycles, they are holding tightly to them. This mismatch creates a quiet emotional distance that cannot be bridged by pretending. You may try to blend in again, to laugh at the same jokes, to participate in the same routines, but something inside you resists because once consciousness opens, it cannot be closed. This is why outgrowing people feels painful. It is not the loss of them, but the loss of the version of you that used to belong there. Yet this discomfort is also proof that your spiritual awakening is real, because growth always requires leaving something behind, including identities, beliefs, and relationships that cannot travel with you into higher awareness. The danger of outgrowing everyone around you lies in the temptation to shrink yourself just to stay connected, to suppress your truth to avoid conflict, or to dim your inner light so others feel comfortable. But doing this disconnects you from your own soul. Your awakening asks you to trust the path, even when it feels lonely, because solitude is not emptiness, it is alignment. In solitude, you hear your intuition more clearly. You notice what nourishes you and what drains you. You learn to choose peace over approval. And as you continue on this path, you eventually discover that the universe always replaces what no longer aligns with something more authentic. New people appear who understand your depth, honor your boundaries, and resonate with the frequency you are growing into. Growth requires shedding, and shedding creates space for a new spiritual chapter. In this way, isolation is not a punishment, but a passage, the natural transition that happens when you move from who you were to who you are becoming. Your only task is to honor the truth within you and allow the old world to fall away without guilt, trusting that your transformation is leading you to the people, experiences, and alignment that match the person your soul has chosen to become. 2. Growth requires leaving the comfort zone. Growth always demands that you leave the comfort zone, because just as a lobster must shed its shell to grow, you must also be willing to shed the layers of identity, beliefs, and expectations that once protected you, but can no longer hold who you are becoming. And this shedding often feels frightening, vulnerable, and deeply unfamiliar. Yet you can feel it in your body and spirit when expansion is calling you. You may try to hold on to what you know, old habits, old friendships, old emotional patterns. But the moment your inner self begins to stretch, those structures start to feel tight, restrictive, and even painful, reminding you that in spirituality and spiritual development, transformation never happens inside familiarity. It happens in the courageous space where you choose growth over comfort. As you step into this space, you may notice the first signs of change in small yet powerful ways. Conversations that once energized you now feel empty. Activities that once defined you no longer express who you are. And relationships that once felt aligned now feel like they belong to a version of you that no longer exists. This moment of realization can feel destabilizing, as though you're being asked to walk away from everything that shaped you. But what is really happening is that your soul is guiding you beyond what is outdated so that it can reveal what is authentic, calling you into deeper truth, whether or not the people around you understand it. And as you continue to grow, the danger of outgrowing everyone around you becomes more visible, not because you have elevated yourself above others, but because you have shifted into a different rhythm, a different level of awareness, a different layer of spiritual sensitivity that not everyone in your environment resonates with. You may worry that others will interpret your growth as arrogance or distance. Yet what is actually happening is a natural divergence between those who are committed to evolving and those who prefer to remain in what feels safe. This divergence can bring moments of loneliness, especially when you start seeing things more clearly, responding more consciously, and choosing what nourishes your soul rather than what maintains familiarity. But loneliness is not a punishment. It is a transition period, the tender space between shedding the old shell and growing the new one. The space where your inner voice becomes louder because there are fewer external voices drowning it out, allowing spiritual development to deepen in ways you could not access while clinging to old roles. You may not feel ready for this shedding, and that is okay. No one ever feels fully ready to outgrow their life, but you are ready enough, and your readiness is shown in the simple truth that staying where you are hurts more than stepping into what is next. So as you move through this process, you will feel moments of grief, moments of liberation, moments of confusion, and moments of clarity, all weaving together into the quiet awakening that tells you that your inner world is evolving faster than your external world can keep up. And even though this evolution may separate you from the familiar, it is leading you toward relationships that match your frequency, environments that honor your growth, and a life that reflects who you truly are. The message you must carry forward is this: your expansion will not always be comfortable, and it will not always be understood, but it will always be necessary, because you were never meant to remain inside a shell that was only built for the earlier stages of your becoming. Comment below: I choose growth over comfort. If you're ready to rise beyond your old limits and step boldly into your higher self. 3. Outgrowing others is not superiority. Outgrowing others is never about being superior. It is about quietly realizing that your inner world is expanding in ways that no longer fit the patterns, expectations, and illusions you once lived inside. And this shift becomes clearer the moment you begin to see how much of your old life was shaped by unconscious conditioning, social pressure, and the need to belong. As Alan Watts said, you are under no obligation to remain the same person you were a moment ago. A truth that reminds you that real transformation is not meant to be glamorous or loud. It is meant to be honest. When you evolve, you do not rise above people. You rise above outdated versions of yourself. And this rise naturally creates distance, not because you are better, but because you are no longer willing to shrink to maintain the comfort of others. Yet this is where the danger quietly appears. When your growth outpaces your surroundings, the mind can slip into the very trap you are trying to escape. Spiritual ego. It whispers that you are more awakened, more conscious, more advanced than the people around you. But as Carl Jung warned, the greater the ego, the more distant one becomes from the soul. Your awakening is not an accomplishment, it is a remembering. It is not a crown, it is a responsibility. True spiritual wisdom demands that you remain rooted in humility even as you expand beyond old environments, because growth that breeds superiority is not growth. It is inflation disguised as enlightenment. Still, you cannot ignore the feeling of drifting from those who once felt familiar. Conversations that once satisfied you now feel shallow. Cycles you once tolerated now feel heavy. And relationships built on your old identity begin to lose their grip. This is not rejection. It is alignment. You are not pushing people away. Your soul simply refuses to dim itself to fit the rooms it has already outgrown. And when others misunderstand your distance, you must remember that evolution is rarely understood by those who are not yet ready to face their own. Outgrowing someone does not mean they are lesser. It simply means your paths are moving in different directions. As you continue expanding, you will notice that your inner clarity makes certain connections fall away naturally. There is no fight, no argument, no dramatic ending, just quiet separation. And in that separation, you may feel guilt, sadness, or confusion, but none of these feelings are signs that you are wrong. They are signs that you care. They are signs that your heart is changing faster than your environment. And it is in this delicate space that true humility becomes essential. You must hold your growth gently, remembering that not everyone evolves at the same pace, and that spiritual awakening is a deeply personal timeline. Real wisdom is knowing how to rise without looking down on anyone, how to advance without abandoning compassion, how to be free without becoming detached from humanity. Because the true danger of outgrowing others is not the distance created between you and them. It is the distance created between you and your own humility. When growth makes you softer instead of harder, kinder instead of colder, and more conscious instead of more superior, then your evolution becomes real, rooted, and aligned with the soul rather than the ego. This is the essence of spiritual awakening, the quiet expansion that Carl Jung spoke of and Alan Watts understood deeply. Growth that humbles you, opens you, and calls you to walk through the world with greater awareness, not greater pride. 4. Dual existence creates inner tension. Awakened individuals often find themselves living in two worlds at once, and this quiet split creates an inner tension that is far deeper than most people realize. On one side, you move through the familiar landscape of everyday life, work, relationships, responsibilities, expectations, where you are still expected to play the same old roles with the same old consistency. Yet on the other side, a different world is opening within you, a world shaped by spirituality and spiritual awakening, where deeper truths rise to the surface, where your perception sharpens, and where the things you once accepted without question suddenly begin to feel hollow, shallow, or misaligned. This inner world pulls you into a kind of clarity that demands emotional intelligence and self-awareness, forcing you to navigate your life without betraying the emerging version of yourself that sees, feels, and understands life on a more profound level. This dual existence can feel like carrying two identities in a single body: the self that others recognize, and the self that is quietly transforming beneath the surface. As you awaken, you notice that conversations once comfortable now leave you empty. Environments once familiar now drain your energy, and people who used to understand you now seem confused by your silence or depth. You begin to sense the widening gap between the world that operates on habit, noise, and external validation, and the inner world that moves with intuition, truth, and a growing need for authenticity. This is where the tension intensifies, because the mystical world of deep truth does not follow the same logic as the conventional world of daily life. And you start to realize that every step you take toward your inner truth creates distance from what no longer resonates. And yet, this tension is not a mistake. It is an initiation. It pushes you to develop balance, not by shrinking or hiding your growth, but by holding your awakening with steadiness while still participating in the external world. with compassion and clarity. It teaches you that the real challenge is not choosing one world over the other, but learning how to move between them without losing yourself. You become more selective with your energy, more deliberate with your choices, more honest with your boundaries, because you understand that protecting your inner world is not selfish. It is necessary for your evolution. The more your consciousness expands, the more you feel the pull between belonging and becoming, between comfort and truth, between who you were and who you are meant to be. This is the tension awakened individuals must learn to navigate, the pressure of carrying deep truth in environments built on surface-level comfort. It requires emotional intelligence to speak gently when you could reveal more, patience to listen when you already understand, and strength to stand firm when others misinterpret your transformation. But as you grow into this balance, you discover that the duality itself becomes your teacher, guiding you to live with depth in a shallow world, to stay awake in places where others are still sleeping, and to honor the world within you without abandoning the world around you. If this message about dual existence and inner tension resonates with you, don't forget to subscribe for more spiritual wisdom that guides you through every stage of your growth. 5. Relationships may deteriorate. As you grow, you will notice that some relationships begin to shift in ways you did not expect, because the moment you start changing from the inside out, certain connections that once felt comfortable suddenly feel distant, strained, or strangely shallow. You may feel as though the people who used to understand you now look at you with confusion, doubt, or silent judgment, not because you have done anything wrong, but because your spiritual development disrupts the familiar roles they were used to, and this discomfort makes them retreat, criticize, or try to pull you back into who you used to be. When your inner world begins to expand, your priorities become different, your values become clearer, and your boundaries become stronger. And although this growth is healthy, it can make others feel like they are losing access to the old version of you they depended on. Some people were comfortable only when you were smaller, quieter, more forgiving of behaviors that drained you. And as you begin to honor your own energy, step into deeper spirituality, and make choices aligned with your truth, you naturally create a distance from anyone who was attached to your past identity. What you must understand is that not everyone can meet you at this new level of awareness, and instead of rising with you, some people react with insecurity because your evolution highlights their stagnation. Conversations that once felt natural may now feel empty because you are no longer interested in gossip, chaos, or surface-level talk. Your mind now gravitates toward depth, clarity, and intention, and this creates an invisible separation between you and those who are not ready for that kind of honesty. You might feel guilt for outgrowing people you once loved deeply, but guilt is only a sign that your heart is compassionate, not a signal that you should shrink yourself. Growth does not wait for anyone, and spirituality will always guide you toward alignment, even when your mind wants to hold on to what is familiar. Some people will criticize you for changing because they miss the version of you that made them comfortable. But their reaction says more about their internal limitations than it does about your progress. When your presence no longer matches the unspoken agreements of a relationship, the relationship naturally loosens its grip. And this is not a failure, it is clarity. You are not abandoning anyone. You are simply refusing to betray yourself for the sake of maintaining connections that can no longer survive your expansion. The people who truly value you will adjust, grow, and learn to understand the person you are becoming, while those who cannot adapt will fade from your life effortlessly. This is the quiet cost of spiritual development. Realizing that not everyone who started with you will continue with you, and that outgrowing people is a sign of deep inner evolution, not selfishness. When these shifts happen, let them happen with grace. Remind yourself that your growth is sacred, and accept that some relationships are meant to teach you, not accompany you forever. 6. Hiding your truth leads to fragmentation. Hiding your truth does not just create a small internal conflict. It creates a deep and ongoing fragmentation within you. Because every time you pretend to be someone you are not, you divide yourself into pieces that no longer know how to work together. When you try to fit in on the outside while awakening on the inside, you begin to live a double life that slowly drains your energy, your clarity, and your authenticity. Alan Watts captured this perfectly when he said, "Trying to define yourself is like trying to bite your own teeth," reminding you that whenever you shapeshift just to be accepted, you move further away from the self that is real. And even though pretending may offer temporary social comfort, it creates long-term spiritual discomfort because you cannot build a peaceful life on top of a divided inner world. This division intensifies because one part of you is waking up seeking truth, craving freedom, wanting deeper spiritual wisdom, while another part clings desperately to the version of you that others approve. Of Carl Jung warned that the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. Yet becoming who you truly are is impossible if you keep abandoning yourself in small, subtle ways. Every time you say yes, when your soul means no. Every time you silence your inner voice to protect someone else's comfort. Every time you pretend you don't feel what you feel, you widen the gap between your outer life and your inner reality. At first, the distance seems manageable, but with time, the gap becomes a canyon you can no longer cross without losing yourself. And as this canyon widens, exhaustion shows up, not because you are weak, but because you are carrying the weight of two identities. Pretending demands performance, and performance demands energy, and eventually the cost becomes unbearable. You start to feel disconnected, misplaced, or strangely absent in your own life. And this is the early stage of what Jung called inner disintegration, the slow collapse of psychological harmony when your conscious and unconscious selves are no longer aligned, when the truth inside you grows stronger, but the role you play on the outside stays the same. Pressure builds, tension rises, and something within you starts to break. This is why hiding your truth is never harmless. It delays your transformation, suppresses your awakening, and forces your soul into silence. It was never meant to endure. Yet no soul stays silent forever. The truth always finds a way back to the surface, often through restlessness, irritation, emotional heaviness, or an unexplained longing for something more. These are not weaknesses. They are signals that your deeper self is tired of being hidden. The danger of outgrowing everyone around you is not the loss of relationships. It is the loss of yourself. If you keep shrinking, to stay where you no longer belong. When you finally stop hiding, when you allow your awakening to be seen instead of suppressed, you stop fragmenting. Your inner world begins to reunite, and you can finally live with the honesty, integrity, and quiet power your soul has been asking for all along. If this insight on the danger of hiding your truth has helped you see the power of living authentically, let us know. When you're ready to embrace your real self and stop fragmenting your spirit, comment, "I choose truth" below. Your engagement helps us create more spiritual wisdom that speaks directly to your journey. 7. The loneliness is a rite of passage. Loneliness in this stage of your growth is not an accident, but a rite of passage carved into the path of every soul moving toward true spirituality. Because when you begin to outgrow your old patterns, your old roles, and the identities you once used to survive, life naturally leads you into a space where the noise fades and the silence becomes your teacher. Although this silence can feel heavy, it is actually the threshold of spiritual awakening that every awakened individual must walk through. This spiritual loneliness, often described as the dark night of the soul, is not a collapse, but a sacred dismantling, a moment when everything that is false, conditioned, or borrowed begins to fall away. It marks the quiet death of the false self, the part of you shaped by expectations, fear, validation seeking, and old emotional wounds. And even though this inner death feels disorienting, it is the only way the authentic self can be born. You may feel as if you no longer belong in the places where you once felt comfortable, as if the conversations around you no longer nourish you, or as if you are drifting away from people you once loved. Yet this drifting is not abandonment, but transformation, a subtle way the universe rearranges your life, so the next chapter can be built on truth rather than illusion. As this transition deepens, the loneliness you experience is not proof that something is wrong with you, but evidence that something deep within you is awakening your intuition, sharpening, your boundaries strengthening, your tolerance for superficiality thinning, and your desire for meaning expanding. The disorientation you feel is the soul shedding what no longer resonates, much like a snake releasing its old skin. It is uncomfortable, but it is necessary because the new self cannot emerge while clinging to old versions of life. This inner crossing between who you were and who you are becoming feels like standing between two worlds, with the past behind you and the future calling you forward. But the bridge between them can only be crossed in solitude, and although solitude feels harsh, it is in this space that you begin to hear your soul clearly for the first time. The false self thrives in noise, but the true self rises in silence. When you look closely, you will realize that this loneliness is not emptiness, but purification, not loss, but rebirth, and not failure, but the beginning of a profound inner reorganization. Everything you are shedding is making room for the real you to finally breathe. One who lives with deeper clarity, stronger integrity, and a truth that no longer bends to fit the world, but invites the world to meet you as you are. 8. A new tribe will find you. When you start shedding the old shell of who you used to be, you undergo a quiet but powerful transformation that naturally distances you from the environments, conversations, and relationships that no longer match your inner growth. And this shift often feels uncomfortable because it forces you to step into a space where familiarity fades before anything new appears. You may try to hold on to the past, not because it fits you anymore, but because you fear the silence that comes with authentic evolution. Yet the truth is that this silence is the doorway to a higher level of spirituality and spiritual development, guiding you toward people who will one day resonate effortlessly with your new vibration. As Alan Watts expresses so clearly with the simple truth, a new tribe will find you. You are meant to cross this in-between phase where everything feels uncertain, because uncertainty is where the old self dissolves and the new self begins to breathe. Once you begin walking the lonely road of truth, you will quickly notice how the most dangerous thing is not the loneliness itself, but the temptation to return to the version of yourself that keeps others comfortable. And you must resist this temptation even when it feels easier. You may want to explain your decisions, justify your growth, or soften your boundaries to avoid making others uncomfortable. But every time you do that, you betray the very awakening your soul has worked so hard to reach. Growth requires honesty, and honesty sometimes creates distance. You are not meant to stay small just because others prefer you that way, and you are not required to slow your spiritual development to match someone else's pace. The people who are aligned with your past cannot walk with you into a future built on self-respect, clarity, purpose, and authenticity. As you continue to rise inwardly, your energy shifts, your values change, your awareness sharpens, and your priorities reorder themselves. And these inner movements create an outer reality that may first feel like loss, but is actually divine rearrangement. You are being cleared, not abandoned. You are being prepared, not punished. This chapter of solitude is not a void, it is a bridge. You are learning how to exist without needing external validation, how to trust the subtle impulses of your intuition, and how to hear your own voice without being drowned out by the expectations of others. Every time you choose truth over approval, you strengthen the frequency that will eventually attract your new tribe, the people who do not require you to shrink, edit yourself, or perform a version of identity you no longer recognize. They will meet you at the level of your growth, not your wounds. Over time, you begin to understand that loneliness is simply the space between your old alignment and your new one. It is temporary, necessary, and deeply meaningful. It teaches you that you are capable of standing on your own feet, following your inner calling, and honoring your transformation even when no one sees it. And when your new tribe finally arrives, you recognize them immediately, not because they are familiar, but because you feel safe, understood, and seen in a way your previous environments could never offer. They will not fear your light. They will match it. They will not question your growth. They will embody it. And in their presence, you realize why you had to walk alone first, so you could discover the strength, clarity, and self-trust needed to build relationships that honor who you are becoming. To honor your journey of growth and trust in the tribe that is meant to find you, declare it with intention. Comment below, "I welcome my new tribe," to affirm your path and inspire others who are walking the same road. In the end, the true danger of outgrowing everyone around you is not the loneliness. It's forgetting that your growth has purpose. As Alan Watts reminds us, transformation asks you to release what no longer aligns so you can rise into who you were always meant to be. If this message from spiritual wisdom spoke to you today, let it guide your steps forward with clarity and courage. And before you go, don't forget to like this video, share it with someone who needs it, subscribe to our channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss any of our upcoming teachings. Your journey continues. Walk it with intention